to that. So now I would like to introduce our next speaker, and she is going to be talking about the Black Women's Sarcoidosis Study with Guideposts for all patients. Dr. Yvette Cozier is an associate professor of epidemiology and the associate dean of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice at Boston University School of Public Health. She is also a senior epidemiologist at the Sloan Epidemiology Center at Boston University School of Medicine, where she is MPI of the Black Women's Health Study, a follow-up of over 59,000 African American women begun in 1995, and the PI of the Black Women's Health Study Sarcoidosis Study. As a social epidemiologist, Dr. Cozier's research has largely focused on the roles of psychosocial stressors and potential modifiers in relation to immune-mediated inflammatory diseases, neurologic, and aging-related conditions. Dr. Cozier currently serves as president of the Society for Epidemiologic Research, the nation's oldest and largest general epidemiology organization. Dr. Cozier.
Excellent. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Great. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Black Women's Health Study and then how we came into working in sarcoidosis. And then I'm going to try to leave 10 minutes for we can have questions and answers at the end. Okay, so I might be moving a little fast, but bear with me. So just in terms of disclosures, I'm on the board of directors for the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, and I'm funded by these agencies. So again, a little bit of the outline. Talk about, start with the historic influences leading to needing the Black Women's Health Study and on from there. So I always begin my talks with this cartoon. When I was a doctoral student and I was working on the Black Women's Health Study as it was beginning, this was in the Boston Globe, right? And it just it seemed quite apt at the time, and it really. You know, we were always asked, why do we need a Black Women's Health Study, right? But this was really the background here. I also have a real love for history, and I feel that history sets the context that we need when we try to move forward in various things. So this is from a graphic from a book by Clayton and Bird. There are actually a two-volume compendium on an American health dilemma, race, medicine, and healthcare in the United States. And I believe volume 1 was a Pulitzer Prize nominee. And so this is a really impressive book on American history. But one of the things that reading their books and following the works of Clayton and Bird was that if we look at the timeline of U.S. history, and again, this is important for context, we look at the timeline that was slavery, almost a quarter of a millennia, almost 250 years, followed by another almost 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. So by the time we got to the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, we're really talking 60 years has lapsed in that time period. That's not very long, and it's within this, when I look at that 60 years, it really explains the idea behind that cartoon that I showed in the first slide there. So this is really the context that we need to keep in mind. So again, why do we need a Black Women's Health Study? In that context, what has been known is that Black women suffer from illness and death from almost every medical disease at a rate that is 2 to 3 times higher than that of their white counterparts. But there have been few studies that have explored that. So the Black Women's Health Study was begun with the goal of establishing a study in the manner in which other studies, primarily of white men and white women, had been established to determine risk factors for many types of disease. Primarily for our study, we are funded mainly by the National Cancer Institute, so cancer is our main outcome. And so we established this cohort, and again, using the methods of these other studies, have followed women forward in time for every 2 years. So when we went to get people to enroll in the study, we went to Essence Magazine, which was really a ubiquitous and remains a ubiquitous feature in many Black households, establishments, churches, barbershops, beauty salons, and so on. And from this, we mailed out a 16-page unsolicited questionnaire to a large number of women, and what we got back were about 59,000 completed questionnaires on women between the ages of 21 and 69. So this was in 1995. Every 2 years since, we have followed them, and then starting this year, we're now going to an every 3-year cycle. And there are many complicated reasons for that, but we're currently in the 2024 follow-up cycle. So it's been 29 years since the study began. So who were the women who joined this study? Their median age was about 38. They had about 80% had education beyond high school, and represent every region of the U.S. and territories. Again, about these questionnaires, every 2 years we update information on a number of important factors. So the anthropometry, height and weight, reproductive history, diet, exercise, sleep, medical history, is where we capture new conditions that have been diagnosed. And we look at a number of other factors that might contribute to health. We've also assessed diet at different time points over the last 29 years. And we have collected biological samples, starting with saliva or mouthwash samples that get some of the cells from the inside of the mouth. We've been able to collect blood samples on about 13,000 women. And again, these are women who are not living all in the same place. They're all over the United States. So just collecting blood at all was quite a feat. To that, we also add, collecting tissue blocks and slides. And again, the study is funded primarily to study cancer. We also link data to other sources, primarily cancer registries, Medicare. We follow up for mortality. And also, we are able to look at the neighborhood and built environments where women live, as well as the environmental characteristics of those neighborhoods by linking to their addresses to EPA data. So in case you didn't know, around the United States on the top of buildings, the Environmental Protection Agency has these monitoring sites that can tell us when we have poor air quality days or good air quality days, and it can measure the components of that as well. So that is of interest to us. And then through all that, we keep in touch with our participants in many different ways. We publish a newsletter, usually twice a year, that we mail out. We send reminder letters when some women are a little behind in getting us back the questionnaire data. We have a participant advisory board that helps to advise us on the types of questions and research questions we should ask. And of course, everyone has to have Facebook, although I guess Facebook is a little passé now. I don't know if it's Instagram, whatever that people are on, but we try to have many ways for our participants to get in touch with us. And then finally, in 2020, which was our 25th anniversary, of course, we all know what happened in 2020, where people could not get together, but through Zoom, we hosted a number of seminars, which, if you go to our website, you can also view the recordings. So now I want to switch a little bit to some of the data that we've collected. So again, from 1996 to 2023, which was the last of our questionnaires. We're now in a new cycle. These are some of the conditions that we have studied. So again, you can see cancer shows up many times, but also other conditions as well that develop over the course of these many years, cardiovascular disease, immune-mediated diseases like we've talked about today, and of course, sarcoidosis, right? We've also, using some of our genomic data, we've studied many things, including sarcoidosis as well. So how did we get on this sarcoidosis journey? I had heard about sarcoidosis as a doctoral student. I knew the definition of it because I had to memorize it for my general pathology exam, right? And then I began, as a doctoral student working, and the questionnaires are coming in, and, part of my job, even as I was pursuing that degree, was to open mail and to look at the questionnaires and make sure there were no stray marks, and we had to do the old electronic scanning to get them into the database, right? And we started to notice a pattern. So this was the page that showed where we asked women, what conditions have you been diagnosed with and when? And so you can see on here, sarcoidosis isn't there. And I remember a question from the previous section is like, when is sarcoidosis going to make it onto it? Well, it didn't make it here, but over 700 women wrote it in. 700 women wrote it in. And that was kind of that, oh. And I remember one of my colleagues saying, what is sarcoidosis? And I knew what it was because I remembered it, right? But then I pulled out the book and we started looking again and thinking, oh, this is really interesting. We never even asked about this. So it turns out Boston University has a sarcoidosis clinic, which I called over to ask them, are you interested in working with us on this? And they said, absolutely. And so on the questionnaires that followed, we did add sarcoidosis. And on every one since, we asked women to write that in. So along with the sarcoidosis clinic, we said we had to validate this. Now that women have reported it, we have to, verify the actual diagnosis. So we created a checklist to send to women, to ask permission to send to their physicians and get information about their condition. And we also created a supplementary questionnaire for participants to fill out who had been diagnosed. Tell us a little bit about your diagnosis. And I'll come back to that. So then from the diagnosis, and over the last 29 years, we have discovered an additional almost 700 new cases or incident cases of disease. Women who on that first questionnaire had never been diagnosed have since been diagnosed. We've, of course, asked them for permission to contact their doctors, give them the checklists, and we've confirmed the diagnosis in about 96% of the women. We've also asked both the new cases and those existing cases when we started if they would complete those supplemental questionnaires so we can learn more about their conditions. But we have found that the self-report in our population is quite accurate, obviously. Now we've published a few things here. This was our first paper, really just describing the disease in our population, and so it was an overall prevalence of 2%. 2% of our cohort had a diagnosis, and this is an average annual incidence, or kind of like the speed of how the illness might move through the population, so 71 per 100,000. Just by reference, some studies, not of black women, will find something like 8 per 100,000. A few might be as high as like 39 per 100,000, but we're at 71 per 100,000. So our rate is a lot higher. And we can see that the peak age of diagnosis in our population was 40 to 49. We compared some of our data to that of the ACCESS study, which had been the previous study to look at multi-site study in the U.S. And so on looking here where we were able to classify the disease of the organ of disease, we can see that access had 95% lung. Many of the clinicians were pulmonologists, but if you add up the lung and the intrathoracic lymph nodes, so that's all in the thorax, we come up to about almost 95%. We're pretty close to them. But we can see some of the other areas in which we had, and the group for other here that included many other organs like kidney and pancreas or thyroid and other organs. We also noticed that our participants with the diagnosis of sarcoidosis also indicated having other conditions as well. Okay, so about 60% of them reported 3 or more of these conditions. Okay, so again, this was asked earlier in the earlier session around how much overlap there is with other conditions and being diagnosed with other things. So we observed that. And then from the reports that we got from their physicians, 58% of the clinicians who were sending back the physician checklist indicated at least one additional condition along with what they had been diagnosed with in addition to their sarcoidosis diagnosis. We found the familial patterns of sarcoidosis, and we had other studies that kind of were a guidepost for that, showing results there. But here, what we found was that 14% of women had a first-degree relative, so that's a mother, father, sister, brother, child, and then double that, 28%, they had the disease in another relative, any other relative in their family. So I'm just going to talk about a few things that we've looked at since. So earlier, when the panel was speaking, the question was asked about when are we going to start looking at the things that cause sarcoidosis. So as an epidemiologist, part of my within my field and area is to look for those causes. And from a public health perspective, it's to try to intervene if we identify things. There's a lot of space between what we see as associations with various factors and saying that that factor actually causes the disease. There's a lot of work that has to go on there. But the place to start is, what are those associations? What are the things that seem to show up a lot that maybe are a place that we can target and prevent future generations from getting the disease? So that's really the focus of where I am. I have less to do with treatments, but more to sort of speculate and try to identify things that are contributing to disease. So one of those things was looking at reproductive and hormonal factors. So there was a lot of literature or a lot of belief that there were gender differentials in the disease, that women were being diagnosed much more than men, and that perhaps it had to do with hormones, high estrogen state. So there had been publications, case reports, and case series out of the clinical spaces that described women who were pregnant having the disease go into improvement or remission, and then coming back postpartum once the baby was born. There were other indications that there was an observed sort of second peak in terms of the age among women, and particularly in Japanese and Scandinavian populations, that indicated perhaps once the menopausal stage was on and estrogen was low, that might be a time that disease would show up again. So we were really the first follow-up study, the first study that could start with people who had never been diagnosed and follow them over time to their diagnosis and then look at these factors. And so this was one of our first analyses. And we had lots of measures from our regular Black Women's Health Study questionnaires. And the data were a bit mixed, but we did find that older age at menopause, so that would be along with the sort of the theory of the estrogen was staying up high, those women had a lower risk and within our data set. We also found, older age at first birth and fewer years in the interval since the last birth. Also, those women seem to have a lower risk. Now, we're not entirely sure what all of that means. Again, there's a difference between association and causation, but this is something that we can perhaps do more work in this area. And I know recently in Sweden, a colleague there, they did an analysis, and they have big cohorts with lots of data, and they found a slight decrease in risk as well, in association with various stages of reproduction. Another study that we led was around body mass index and risk of developing disease. So again, we had the privilege of starting with individuals who were not diagnosed and following them forward in time. So unlike people who come into the clinic in which they might have already been on short-term steroids and maybe their weight was heavier when they were diagnosed, we were able to look from our data and say, well, what did they weigh when they were 18? Because we actually collected that data. What did they weigh in 1995 before they were ever diagnosed? Because we collected that data. And so we had a hypothesis, and it wasn't just ours, this again is from the literature, that having a high body mass index might, or even increased adiposity, it might be a low grade of systemic inflammation. So earlier in the panel, when we were talking about what is a granuloma, what starts a granuloma, and that it's something that's responding to some form of inflammation, unknown and uncontrolled, well, maybe that sets a little bit of that condition. That's part of the hypothesis. And so we also know that increased adiposity is a risk factor for many health conditions. And there was some data showing that conditions like lupus the incidence has been higher in higher BMI individuals, and also some of the Danish studies, again in Scandinavia, were showing some associations. So we followed this, and what we saw was among the women who had higher body mass index when they were 18 years old, we saw they had the highest risk of developing sarcoidosis over like a 14-year period. We also saw, when we looked at their body mass index at the beginning of the BWHS, the beginning of the study, those who had the body mass index that was 30 and higher, they had an increased risk as well. Okay, so again, not causation, but association. And it gives us some idea that there could be some mechanism of uncontrolled inflammation that makes some people more susceptible. So we went, I'm at Boston University, so we went, about a mile across town to our colleagues at Harvard University, right, which is home to the Nurses' Health Study cohorts. And the Nurses' Health Study 2, it's a cohort of 116,000 female nurses who are within the same age range as the Black Women's Health Study participants. They are 98% white women, but they do have a small number of Black, Latino, and Asian nurses that are involved. But we asked them, can we look at your data, or can we look together and see, one, do you have reports of sarcoidosis? They didn't think they did. I asked them to look, and then they said, hey, we do. We actually have sarcoidosis. So then we started to look at, well, what do you see in relation to body mass index? So this is what they saw. They also saw at age 18, those who were heavier and overweight had higher risk of developing this, and this was over like a 20-year period because their cohort had been ongoing a little longer than ours at the time. And then looking at the way they did it was the 2 years, so if someone reported a new case of sarcoidosis in, say, 1999, they'd look at their body mass index in 1997. So they looked at the 2 years before. And again, they saw the same pattern, overweight and those who were in the higher BMI category had higher risk. I know that in Scandinavia, in Sweden, they've recently done a study and have found similar results. So what does this mean about BMI? This is now, we find this association, it just creates more questions than we thought that we would have otherwise. But basically, the questions are, now that we have this association, does BMI actually influence the type of symptoms that someone has, how severe their symptoms are? Is BMI the only and best measure of one's body? Waist-hip ratio, waist circumference, there are many other measures that might be more meaningful. We didn't have data on all of those, but this is something for the future that we could look at. Does the risk, is it the same according to biological sex? So in Sweden, their study of men and women found an association like we did, but our colleague, Mark Judson, a prominent sarcoidosis researcher in New York, upstate New York, in a large sample of mostly male U.S. veterans, found no association. So where the question is the distribution of body fat different? Are the metabolic profiles different? So this leads to more areas that we can explore. So here I want to switch just very briefly to the area of religion and health. So Dr. Tavi earlier, I had cut this from my slides, but she really inspired me to put this back, this area, because of the wonderful presentation she gave. And this is some other work that we've done in the Black Women's Health Study, not specifically with sarcoidosis, but in our general population. So we began studying religion and spirituality and its influence on health about 2005. And there was a lot of research that was then looking at, how religion might be used to cope with health. And there have been studies that certain, religious practices like around diet and all have made some cohorts or some groups of people seem to be healthier than others. And so, we know that this can shape not just individual beliefs and behaviors, but also provides incredible support and a sense of meaning. A survey that was done back in about 2010 about religiosity, according to Black and white respondents, it seemed to indicate that, at least among the Black respondents, that religion and its importance in their daily lives was about 90% compared to 75%, which is still pretty high. But we also have seen research that indicates when it comes to engagement with the healthcare system, Black patients were more likely to say that they really leaned on their faith to cope with that. So this was our desire. What we wanted to find out was, how does this work? So on our 2005 questionnaire, we asked this series of questions: how often do you attend religious services? How often do you pray? How do you use religion to cope with stress? And do you consider yourself a religious or spiritual person? We also developed another survey, a supplemental survey, which we used in our cohort, but also in 5 other cohorts. So this was the study on stress, spirituality, and health. And you can see that we engaged with the Nurses' Health Study again. We also engaged with the study of Latinos, the Strong Heart Study of Native Americans, and the Masala Study of Southeast Asians. And looking here, among the Black Women's Health Study participants for almost every factor except for like yoga, right? And yoga is good, right? According to Dr. Taffy, right? It's very good. We see that our participants really kind of used religion to a bit more than the other groups use religion in their daily lives. So just a couple of an analysis looking at mortality. So those who attended services more frequently had lower mortality over a period of time. And looking at hypertension, those who reported using religion very often to cope with personal stress had lower rates of hypertension. So this is just, again, another feather, right? Another association to look at that perhaps in future studies we can apply to other studies, but also to that of sarcoidosis. So just to wrap up, our future directions. We've updated the supplemental questionnaire that we're sending to women who have the diagnosis. So we queried them before, and now we're coming up with this much more detailed questionnaire that covers dimensions of sleep, pain, quality of life, economic impact of the condition, and again, following up on part of the earlier conversation with the panel, the relationship with other immune-mediated conditions. So we have seen in our data a number of women with sarcoidosis who also have inflammatory bowel disease, or who also have lupus, and sometimes they might have all three of those things. And so we are trying to ascertain when these other diagnoses were made relative to sarcoidosis. Was sarcoidosis the most recent, or since sarcoidosis have some of these developed? And as Dr. Culver said, you can't always tell which came first, which manifests first is really the difference. So we're trying to delve more into that and see what things are in common with those overarching, those conditions, and perhaps that could be a place that we can target. We're looking at diet. I saw that we measured diet over 4 different questionnaire cycles, so we're currently analyzing dietary patterns and risk of sarcoidosis, and also like vitamin D intake, so nutrient intake. But then ultimately we could look at diet as a disease modifier. And then religion and spirituality, looking at the practice and coping with mental health and physical health and quality of life, both overall in the Black Women's Health Study, but also in regards to sarcoidosis. So just to wrap up, the Black Women's Health Study in general is a resource for helping to understand Black women's health, and we engaged a number of risk factors, both traditional, some of the psychosocial, and even genetic, and the goal really is to prevent disease in the long run. I know that the part of my title was offering guideposts, and I don't know if I've offered any guideposts, but if there's one that I could throw out there is that, this is really my life's mission, and I'm, dedicated to training others to come up behind me. And if that's a guidepost, that that I and others are in your corner, and that we are here to see a cure and to see this disease fully understood and dealt with. So